Nicorn of Ilmar was not a young man. He was well past 50, but had preserved his youth. His face was that of a peasant, firm-boned but not fleshy. His eyes were keen and hard as he stared at Elric, who had been mockingly propped in a chair. "So you are Elric of Melniboné, the wolf of the snarling sea, spoiler, reaver, and woman-slayer. I think you could hardly slay a child now. However, I will say that it discomforts me to see any man in such a position, particularly one who has been so active as you. Was it true what the spellmaker says? Were you sent here by my enemies to assassinate me?" Elric was concerned for his men. What would they do? Wait or go on? If they stormed the palace now, they were doomed, and so was he. "Is it true?" Nicorn was insistent. "No," whispered Elric. "My quarrel was with Thelebkana. I have an old score to settle with him." "Well, I'm not interested in old scores, my friend," Nicorn said, not unkindly. "I am interested in preserving my life. Who sent you here?" "Thelebkana speaks falsely if he told you I was sent," Elric lied. "I was interested only in paying my debt." "It is not only the sorcerer who told me, I'm afraid," Nicorn said. "I have many spies in the city, and 2 of them independently informed me of a plot by local merchants to employ you to kill me." Elric smiled faintly. "Very well," he agreed. "It was true, but I had no intention of doing what you asked." "I had no intention of doing what they asked." Nicorn said, "I might believe you, Elric of Melniboné, but now I do not know what to do with you. I would not turn anyone over to Thelebkana's mercies. May I have your word that you will not make an attempt on my life again?" "Are we bargaining, Master Nicorn?" Elric said faintly. "We are." "Well, then what do I give my word in return for, sir?" "Your life and freedom, Lord Elric." "And my sword?" Nicorn shrugged regretfully. "I'm sorry, not your sword." "Then take my life," said Elric brokenly. "Come now, my bargain's good. Have your life and freedom and give your word that you will not plague me again." Elric breathed deeply. "Very well." Nicorn moved away. Thelebkana, who had been standing in the shadows, put a hand on the merchant's arm. "You are going to release him?" "Aye," Nicorn said. "He's no threat to either of us now." Elric was aware of a certain feeling of friendship in Nicorn's attitude towards him. He too felt something of the same. He was a man both courageous and clever, but, Elric fought madness, without Stormbringer, what could he do to fight back? The 200 Imrerian warriors lay hidden in the undergrowth as dusk gave way to night. They watched and wondered. What had happened to Elric? Was he now in the castle, as Divim Tvar thought? The Dragon Master knew something of the art of divining, as did all members of the royal line of Melniboné. From what small spells he had conjured, it seemed that Elric now lay within the castle walls. But without Elric to battle Thelebkana's power, how could they take it? Nicorn's palace was also a fortress, bleak and unlovely. It was surrounded by a deep moat of dark, stagnant water. It stood high above the surrounding forest, built into, rather than onto, the rock. Much of it had been carved out of the living stone. It was sprawling and rambling and covered in a large area, surrounded by natural buttresses. The rock was porous in places, and slimy water ran down the walls of the lower parts, spreading through dark moss. It was not a pleasant place, judging from the outside, but it was almost certainly impregnable. 200 men could not take it without the aid of magic. Some of the Melnibonean warriors were becoming impatient. There were a few who muttered that Elric had once again betrayed them. Divum Tvar and Moonglum did not believe this. They had seen the signs of conflict and heard them in the forest. They waited, hoping for a signal from the castle itself. They watched the castle's great main gate, and their patience at last proved of value. The huge wood and metal gate swung inwards on chains, and a white-faced man in the tattered regalia of Melnibone appeared between two desert warriors. They were supporting him, it seemed. They pushed him forward. He staggered a few yards along the causeway of slimy stone which bridged the moat. Then he fell. He began to crawl wearily, painfully forward. Moonglum growled. What have they done to him? I must help him. But Divum Tvar held him back. No, it would not do to betray our presence here. Let him reach the forest first, and then we can help him. Even those who had cursed Elric now felt pity for the albino as, staggering and crawling alternately, he dragged his body slowly towards them. From the battlements of the fortress a tittering laugh was borne down to the ears of those below. They also caught a few words. "What now, wolf?" said the voice. "What now?" Moonglum clenched his hands and trembled with rage, hating to see his proud friend so mocked in his weakness. What's happened to him? What have they done? Patience, Divum Tvar said. We'll find out in a short while. It was an agony to wait until Elric finally crawled on his knees into the undergrowth. Moonglum went forward to aid his friend. He put a supporting arm around Elric's shoulders, but the albino snarled and shook it off. His whole countenance aflame with terrible hate, made more terrible because it was impotent. Elric could do nothing to destroy that which he hated. Nothing. Divum Tvar said urgently, Elric, you must tell us what happened. If we're to help you, we must know what happened. Elric breathed heavily and nodded his agreement. His face partially cleared of the emotion he felt, and weakly he stuttered out the story. So, Moonglum growled, our plans come to nothing, and you have lost your strength forever. Elric shook his head. There must be a way. There must. What? How? If you have a plan, Elric, let me hear it now. Elric swallowed thickly and mumbled, Very well. Moonglum, you shall hear it, but listen carefully, for I have not the strength to repeat it. Moonglum was a lover of the night, but only when it was lit by the torches found in cities. He did not like the night when it came to open countryside, and he was not fond of it when it pressed a castle such as Nycorn's. But he moved on and hoped for the best. If Elric had been right in his interpretation, then the battle might yet be won, and Nycorn's palace taken. But it still meant danger for Moonglum, and he was not one to deliberately put himself into danger. As he viewed the stagnant waters of the moat with distaste, he reflected that this was enough to test any friendship to the utmost. Philosophically, he lowered himself down into the water and began to swim across it. The moss on the fortress offered a flimsy handhold, but it led to ivy which gave a better grip. Moonglum slowly clambered up the wall. He hoped that Elric had been right and that Thalabkaana would need to rest for a while before he could work more sorcery. That was why Elric had suggested he make haste. Moonglum clambered on and eventually reached the small, unbarred window he sought. A normal-sized man could not have entered, but Moonglum's small frame was proving useful. He wriggled through the gap, shivering with cold, landed on the hard stone of a narrow staircase which ran both up and down the interior walls of the fortress. Moonglum frowned and then took the steps leading upwards. Elric had given him a rough idea of how to reach his destination. Expecting the worst, he went soft-footed up the stone steps. He went towards the chambers of Yashana, Queen of Jakor. an hour, Moonglum was back, shivering with cold and dripping with water. In his hands, he carried Stormbringer. He carried the rune sword with cautious care, nervous of its sentient evil. It was alive again, with black, pulsating life. Thank the gods I was right, Elric murmured weakly from where he lay, surrounded by 2 or 3 Imrerians, including Divim Tvar, who was staring at the albino with concern. I prayed that I was correct in my assumption, and Thaleb Kana was resting after his earlier exertions on my behalf. He stirred, and Divim Tvar helped him to sit upright. Elric reached out a long white hand, reached like an addict of some terrible drug towards the sword. "Did you give her my message?" he asked, as he gratefully seized the pommel. "Aye," Moonglum said shakily, "and she agreed." "You were also right in your other interpretation, Elric. It did not take her long to inveigle the key out of a weary Thaleb Kana. The sorcerer was tremendously tired, and Nykorn was becoming nervous, wondering if an attack of any kind would take place while Thaleb Kana was incapable of action. She went herself to the cupboard and got me the blade." "Women can sometimes be useful," said Divim Tvar dryly, "though usually in matters like these they're a hindrance." It was possible to see that something other than immediate problems of taking the castle were worrying Divim Tvar, but no one thought to ask him what it was that bothered him. It seemed a personal thing. "I agree, Dragon Master," Elric said almost gaily. The gathered men were aware of the strength which poured swiftly into the albino's deficient veins, imbuing him with a new hell-born vitality. "It's time for our vengeance, but remember, no harm to Nykorn. I gave him my word." He folded his right hand firmly around Stormbringer's hilt. "Now for a sword quenching. I believe I can obtain the help of just the allies we need to keep the sorcerer occupied while we storm the castle. I'll need no pentacle to summon my friends of the air." Moonglum licked his long lips. "So it's sorcery again. In truth, Elric, this whole country is beginning to stink of wizardry and the minions of hell." Elric murmured for his friend's ears. "No hell beings these, but honest elementals, equally powerful in many ways. Curb your belly fear, Moonglum. A little more simple conjuring and Thaleb Kana will have no desire to retaliate." The albino frowned, remembering the secret pacts of his forefathers. He took a deep breath and closed his pain-filled scarlet eyes. He swayed, the runesword half loose in his grip. His chant was low, like the far-off moaning of the wind itself. His chest moved quickly up and down, and some of the younger warriors, those who had never been fully initiated into the ancient lore of Melniboné, stirred with discomfort. Elric's voice was not addressing human folk. His words were for the invisible, the intangible, the supernatural. An old and ancient rhyme began, the casting of word runes. "Hear the doomed one's dark decision. Let the wind giant's wail be heard. Gaol and Misha's mighty moaning. Send my enemy like a bird. By the sultry scarlet tones, by the bane of my black blade, by the lass Ha's lonely mewling, let a mighty wind be made. Speed of sunbeams from their homeland, swifter than the sundering storm. Speed of arrow deerwards shooting, let the sorcerer so be born." His voice broke, and he called high and clear, "Misha! Misha, in the name of my fathers, I summon thee, Lord of Winds." Almost at once the trees of the forest suddenly bent as if some great hand had brushed them aside. A terrible, soughing voice swam from nowhere, and all but Elric, deep in his trance, shivered. "Elric of Melniboné," the voice roared like a distant storm, "we knew your fathers. I know thee. The debt we owe the line of Elric is forgotten by mortals, but Graol and Misha, kings of the wind, remember, How may the Lasahar aid thee? The voice seemed almost friendly, but proud and aloof and awe-inspiring. Elric, completely in a state of trance now, jerked his whole body in convulsions. His voice shrieked piercingly from his throat, and the words were alien, unhuman, violently disturbing to the ears and nerves of human listeners. Elric spoke briefly, and then the invisible wind giant's great voice roared and sighed. "I will do as thee desire." Then the trees bent once more, and the forest was still and muted. Somewhere in the gathered ranks a man sneezed sharply, and this was the sign for the others to start talking, speculating. For many moments Elric remained in his trance, and then quite suddenly he opened his enigmatic eyes and looked gravely around him, puzzled for a second. Then he clasped Stormbringer more firmly and leaned forward, speaking to the men of Imrir. "Soon Thalebkana will be in our power, my friends, and so also will we possess the loot of Nykorn's palace." But Divam Tvar shuddered then. "I'm not so skilled in the esoteric arts as you, Elric," he said quietly, "but in my soul I see 3 wolves leading a pack to slaughter. One of those wolves must die. My doom is near me, I think." Elric said uncomfortably, "Worry not, Dragon Master. You'll live to mock the ravens and spend the spoils of Bakshan." But his voice was not convincing.